Hi, this is Jeff Simmons. I'm Senior Counsel at Ames and Boone and an adjunct professor at the University of Texas School of Law. I've been privileged to work with Trammell Crow and EarthX in assembling a Blue Ribbon Advisory Council of environmental law practitioners to develop, among other things, a series of TV programs riffing on law and order and law and nature, which we've labeled Law and Nature. We were heartened by the response to our first program, which is now available on demand. That program presented a dive into what the election portends for the future of environmental law. Although that program remains topical and is worth seeing, we thought that now that we've had an election, it makes sense to have a follow-up program focused on what the Biden administration in particular portends for the future of environmental law, and to bring back our three panelists, joined by another distinguished panelist who was not available to us before. It's my privilege to again introduce our moderator, John Cruden, partner in the law firm of Beveridge and Diamond. Uh, Among other things, John was former Assistant Attorney General of the Department of Justice, responsible for some of the highest level, highest profile environmental cases that the department handled, including Exxon Valdez, Love Canal, Deepwater Horizon, and the Volkswagen emissions scandal. Uh, as I mentioned then, John's accomplishments and awards were too numerous to mention, but since that program, John was awarded the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources its Lifetime Achievement Award in environmental law and policy. And John is only one of three folks to receive this award. It's my great pleasure to again introduce my friend and one of the giants in our field, John Cruden, who will in turn introduce our other distinguished panelists. Take it away, John.
Jeff, thank you for that kind invitation. And on behalf of all of us, to EarthX viewers and to Trammell Crow and Bruce Fogarty, who put all this together, we thank you for once again listening to us. As Jeff said, we spoke to you before the election about issues that we thought were important in environmental law and policy. And now we're going to focus on what has happened since that election and what that means for our future. The panelists here are just extraordinary. These are the best that we could draw from. Dan Esty is a professor of law at Yale Law School, but he's also the former director of the Connecticut Department of Energy and the Environment. And some of you heard because of him speak before at EarthX, because he's the author of the book, A Better Planet, 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. Scott Fulton, who's speaking to us from Rome, Italy, is the president of one of the leading NGOs in the United States, the Environmental Law Institute. But he's also the former general counsel of the Environmental Protection Agency and a former leader at Department of Justice. And then Seth Jaffe, who's a partner in Boston at Foley Hoag, but Seth is also a leading author. He puts out the Law and Environment blog, and he's the past president of the American College of Environmental Lawyers. So as you can see, we have drawn an extraordinary group with various expertise. We want you to be thinking like you are in our living room. And we're going to give you and talk with you as family members about current issues and what that would mean for the future. We all understand we are in extraordinary time. We just completed an amazing election with the highest vote count ever, with the highest number of mail-in votes ever, the first woman elected as a vice president. But at the same time that's happening, the coronavirus continues. The numbers of new sickness is now sometimes over 100,000 a day. And on behalf of all panel members, every one of you who have had family members or friends ill or passed away, our heart goes out to you. We've heard better news about a possibility of a vaccine, and the Biden administration has already indicated that that's their highest priority and had a task force. And so we know that these are really, really, really difficult times for everyone, but we want to focus on the future. The future is what the Constitution has provided us, this extraordinary process where we go from an election in November, in this case, to a new administration in January. And what happens in between? What happens in that time period? That's the transition period. And then when it finally does happen, what goes on with Congress? What goes on with courts? What does all that mean? And so what we're going to do today is we're going to start with Dan Esty, who's been part of a transition before, and to talk about that extraordinary process. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the themes, environmental and natural resource themes of the Biden platform and the Biden administration. And then we're going to turn it over to Scott Fulton, and Scott will bring in Congress in order to meet some of those themes that I'm going to announce. Congress plays a significant role. What does that mean? How is that going to occur? And then finally, Seth Jaffe is going to clean it all up. He's going to be putting it together because Seth is going to talk about what tools does a president have to accomplish the kind of goals that we're going to be talking about. And what about the role of the courts? What about judicial review? So Dan, start us out and talk to us about this amazing process that we're in right now, a transition from one president to another.
John, thank you very much. Thank you all who are participating as viewers of this program. Look forward to the dialogue that John has promised you. So I did participate in the transition that brought President Obama into office in 2008, 2009. So I'm going to share with you a perspective from being on the ground. But let's start by saying that there is a federal law that defines the transition process. The Presidential Transition Act of 1963 spells out very specifically that resources are to be made available to the new president-elect, and that includes access for the key participants on that president-to-be's team to national security briefings, and frankly, to access fully all of the agencies of government. It provides funding, it provides office space. The General Services Administration is the particular party that the president-elect's team works with, but there is already in place an agreement between the Biden team and the GSA that expects office space to be provided for 500 people. I don't know whether in our pandemic moment that's going to be fully required, but in the past, that's about how many people would be in the central transition office. It's also important to note that beyond that, there would be specific teams assigned to various departments and agencies. So I was part of a team that went to the EPA, about 20 of us, almost all from the Biden, at that moment, the Obama campaign team. So it was people who'd worked with the Obama campaign, and I'm sure that what the Biden team will do the same, assign a dozen, 15, maybe 20 people who've been working on the campaign issues related to the environment to go into the EPA. And there'll be a different team going into the Department of Interior, another team at the Energy Department, a further team at the Forest Service. So there are going to be teams fanning out across the federal government, again, authorized by law to go in and get briefings. And here are the kind of things that transition team will be looking for. First, they want to understand what the big issues are in front of each and every agency that the new president will soon have responsibility for. So there'll be briefings on issues under consideration. There will be questions around what legislative efforts might be underway, particular focus on what regulatory packages are moving through the agency, and frankly, which ones have just been issued, as those are open to particular review. There's also likely to be special briefings about court cases that are underway, because there will be a chance for the new administration to review the position of the United States government in that they will now represent that government, and perhaps to reverse course with regard to defending some of the existing cases that are in place. Specifically, I would think in the case of the many legal challenges that have been brought against various Trump regulatory rollbacks, you'll see a new team reverse course very quickly. The other thing that the transition team will be trying to do is establish whether there are positions that need to be clarified right out of the box, perhaps in the first week, some maybe in the first day of the new administration by executive order. We already know in the case of the Biden team that they've been very clear that they expect to rejoin the Paris climate change agreement on day one. And there may well be a series of other executive orders emanating out on that first day or in the days that follow. But the transition team is setting up the platform for all of this. They're thinking their way through the issues. They're advising the White House on what might be done, what could be done, what should be done, and really laying the foundation for the 4 years to follow. So all of that, again, is part of a prescribed process. And I expect we'll see those transition teams named very shortly. So John, let me pass it back to you.
Thank you very much. And so I'm not going to do justice to the entirety of the Biden platform on environment, energy, and natural resources issue, but I do want to highlight some of the major themes that has been promoted during the campaign, and then start with what one of them was what Dan has said, and that is President or elect Biden has said on the very first day I'm in office, I am going to bring us back into the Paris Accord. That shows you that climate is going to be a major environmental theme. He's talked about it. He's talked about it in his recently as that being exceptionally important to him. And if you look at the platform, you'll see that that climate issues actually dominate the environmental goals that he has. He wants us to be at net zero emissions by 2050. He would have public companies disclose their greenhouse gas emissions and risk issues. One of the more potent climate issues is methane, and he would have new methane regulations, new standards, efficiency standards for appliances and buildings, and a huge R&D effort, all looking at things like carbon capture and storage, all things to promote climate. So again, a central theme in the environmental area for the new administration would be things all related to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. A second, though, is environmental justice. Every administration comes in and makes changes into the organizational structure, but one of the proposals of the administration would be to create a new litigating division at the Department of Justice. Right now, the Department of Justice has 7 litigating divisions: tax, criminal law, civil law, antitrust, and so forth, and then has an environment and natural resources division, which, as Jeff told you, I used to head. Their proposal is to create a new division, which would be climate and environmental justice. And I think that's just an indication of how important they consider those two issues to be. In environmental justice, they would, have new White House consuls, so that would, by itself, put more emphasis on that area. They look at Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to try to breathe more support, more legal structure for that area. And so environmental justice is more than a simple concept. It is a vocabulary that the administration would use to look at racial injustice, to look at Black Lives Matter, but look at it in an environmental context to make sure, I believe, that all individuals are not only treated equally, but have an equal opportunity to good air and good land and good water. So another whole area is environmental justice. In energy, which is closely related to the climate issues, again, a whole list of goals that the administration would like to move forward with. They promote advanced biofuels. They very much promote zero emission vehicles and say that the government would then be required, the federal government, to just at some stage just buy zero emission vehicles. They have a goal of 500,000 charging stations, a complete emphasis on alternative energy, particularly wind and solar. And they said they would double offshore wind during their time. There are others. There are other issues that we can talk about when we have questions. The things on public land that they would do. They certainly support the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and would ban oil and gas permitting on federal land and hydraulic fracturing on federal land. They would support more enforcement and look at communities and do in particularly clean air areas more fence line monitoring. But hold these thoughts: more climate, environmental justice, more energy related issues, looking at public lands. Those are the kind of thematic issues we would expect the new administration to be talking about. So keeping that in mind, I want to turn this over to Scott Fulton and ask Scott, how does all this work with a Congress? Because some of this would require a legislation. Will that work?
Good question, John. Good to be back together again and to have Dan with us this time. Wow, what an incredible moment we're in. I've been given the task of sizing up what has transpired in the congressional elections, trying to figure out what that means. So let's size it up. Situation in the House of Representatives is settled at this point. Despite some Republican gains, we know that the Democrats will retain control of the House in the next Congress. The Senate is, however, the part of our composite that will remain somewhat inchoate until early January. As things currently stand in the next Congress, the 100-member Senate will include at least 50 elected Republicans. That means that the only path to controlling the Senate for Democrats is to win both of the runoff elections in Georgia, scheduled for January 5th, by unseating 2 Republican incumbents, Senators Perdue and Loeffler. In that case, the Democrats would have 50 seats, the vice president then becoming the tiebreaker for purposes of determining majority. Based on the first round voting, the prospect of the Democratic challengers winning both of the runoffs may be a tall order. In round 1, John EarthxLaw finished behind Senator Perdue by an almost decisive margin. And there are questions about how Raphael Warnock, while prevailing in the first round with less than 40% of a 3-way split, will fare in a head-to-head contest with Senator Loeffler. But who's to say? Georgia is suddenly looking a bit purple. There will be a lot of money from Democratic supporters around the country likely pouring into Georgia in the run-up to the runoff. And both of the incumbents have strong ties to President Trump. We'll see how the pluses and minuses of that association shake out in the wake of the president's loss of the presidency and Georgia's own moment of redefinition. But we, of course, can also expect a lot of Republican money to be pouring into Georgia to help preserve Republican control of the Senate. If the Democrats were able to flip these 2 seats, and of course, the opportunity space for the Biden administration to work with the Congress on significant legislation becomes huge. But I'm going to reserve the rest of my commentary for the scenario that may be slightly more likely and would produce a considerably more nuanced future. And that is that the blue surge in the Senate may fall slightly short, such that the Republicans retain control of the Senate. So what could we expect if there is Democratic control of the White House and the House of Representatives, but Republican control of the Senate? Let me mention a few things quickly. Environmental legislation. Yes, it's true that from a lawmaking standpoint, the Congress with divided chambers could once again be effectively stalemated. But with a White House not only open to, but interested in advancing an environmental agenda, it does open up some possibilities, I think, in terms of some progressive but centrist environmental legislation. John mentioned climate change as a theme. I think there might be some possibilities in that space. Maybe we can talk about that more when we get to our discussion, as well as some other legislative opportunities. I'll note that the viability of environmental legislative initiatives will depend to some extent on where they fall in the administration's legislative queue. It may be reading too much into it, but I noticed that that climate change fell 5th in the president-elect's priority list after, most noticeably, healthcare. That may not have intended to be an order of priority, but that's how it was offered. I'll just observe that the teaching from the last 2 Democratic administrations is that the pursuit of healthcare legislation can consume an enormous amount of an administration's available bandwidth. So the The queuing on this bears watching. Appropriations. Republican control over the Senate means significant continued Republican influence over the budget process. This will limit the administration's flexibility in plussing up or moving resources to match administration priorities. Appointments. Because the major presidential appointments all require Senate confirmation, Republican controlled the Senate will likely be fairly influential in the appointments process. While first-term administrations are usually shown some deference in setting up their team, these are unusual times. Some of this will turn on the contrariness tone that Mitch McConnell sets up for the overall relationship. But on the whole, I think the administration will find itself moving towards more centrist nominees than might have otherwise been the case. Congressional Review Act. Last time we met, we discussed the aggressive use of the CRA in the early days of the Trump administration to undo Obama rules. With Republicans controlling the Senate, the CRA is unlikely to be a factor in dealing with Trump rules. Oversight. While oversight capacity can atrophy when not used, and it hasn't been used very much by the Senate over the last 4 years, my guess is that the Senate oversight machinery, fairly active 4 years ago, will pick up speed fairly quickly and will once again be a fly in the administration's ointment. So that's just a quick assessment of some of the things to think about as we anticipate this divided leadership situation in Washington. But let me stop there and get it over to Seth so we can hear from him and get on to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Pleasure being with all of you. Look forward to the discussion. So, yeah, this is the part where the rubber hits the road, and we talk about what can actually get done and how it would get done. So, the short version, I think everybody would assume, is Biden's going to do all the above. He's going to do orders and guidance and regulations and statutes if he can. And the short version of that is orders can be undone by orders, regulations can be undone by regulations, statutes require new statutes. Simple framework, important to keep in mind. I think, as some of you have already alluded to, certainly in the first days, there's going to be a significant number of orders, and a significant percentage of those actually will deal with energy and environment. I think we need to keep in mind another sort of kind of dichotomy here, which is undoing what Trump did versus having an affirmative agenda of your own. It's going to be a lot easier for Biden to undo much of what Trump did than it's going to be, particularly without control of the Senate, accomplishing an affirmative agenda. That being said, there isn't that much more to say about orders. Things like secret science and all those sorts of issues where Trump issued a range of executive orders purporting to direct the executive branch to do various things. All those are going to go by the wayside very quickly. The only important thing to note here is executive orders are a little bit different because they are limited to the executive branch. Judicial review of those is different. I still expect this administration to be much more careful than the prior administration, and that's across the board on orders and on regulations. Statutes aren't purely in the administration's hands, so I'll leave those separately, but this administration is going to dot its I's and cross its T's. On the other hand, that's not that hard to do, frankly. And, I'm showing my stripes a little bit, but my sense always was with the Trump administration that it cared much more about the tweets. And I mean this literally. It cared much more about the tweets than about the substance. It was riling up the base. And while I have a view about that, I don't even mean that pejoratively. That's just what the administration's priority was. It was delegitimizing, much of the traditional environmental agenda. And it was doing that via its public relations agenda, I'll call it. So the fact that much of what Trump did was considered shaky and they suffered a lot of judicial defeats doesn't mean that even with now much more conservative courts, that the sort of basic undoing stuff as opposed to the doing stuff is going to be at risk. They can undo much of what Trump did without judicial review being a problem. The affirmative agenda is going to be much more difficult. Let's start with the undoing part and the rules. So to get a little more specific, there are 3 or 4 big rules, which if I can squeeze in the time, we'll cover. One is the Clean Power Plan and the Affordable Clean Energy Plan. It's interesting because I tend to ignore oral arguments because it's just speculation and people just like to read tea leaves. But my sense is the Trump plan has faced some serious skepticism before the DC Circuit recently. I still think you may end up with nothing because I think that a conservative Supreme Court was never going to be in the cards that the Clean Power Plan survived. And in fact, depending upon the authority Biden has, they almost don't care about the Clean Power Plan. They have much more ambitious things that are going to be much more. But I do think the new administration could not simply eliminate the ACE rule and go back to Clean Power Plan, because I don't think Clean Power Plan stands much chance of surviving. Whether the ACE rule survives almost doesn't matter, because that falls under the heading of things that can be undone. As the Trump administration did in a number of cases, the Biden administration will go in and say, can we stay this litigation? We're relooking at it. We're figuring out what we can do. So that's one. As to what they can actually do, maybe we'll save that for our discussion. But my view is fairly shortly, we're not going to have a Clean Power Plan or an ACE rule. WOTUS rule. Here's one where tough to undo regulation by regulation. It's interesting question whether the Obama WOTUS rule would survive judicial review. I think that's a closer question than the ACE rule, but it's still by no means certain that if the Biden administration simply withdrew the Trump WOTUS rule and tried to go back to the Obama rule, that they could survive on that. There are 2 issues about review of WOTUS. One is the science is all on the side of the Obama rule, and you get into issues about agency discretion and deference and that sort of thing. And I think Obama rule and now the Biden administration adopting that, even in front of conservative courts, is going to do pretty well. The problem is that the Trump administration didn't really rely on made up science. They relied on the notion that the statutory authority just didn't go far enough to allow what Obama did to be lawful. And I think that's a close question, at least before this Supreme Court. And there's a decent chance that this Supreme Court would say, no, you don't have authority to go that far. I expect the Biden administration to go back to the Obama rule. It is scientifically defensible. And then we'll see. And given how long these things take, we'll see whether this can get done in 4 years even. But I expect the WOTUS rule eventually to make it back to the Supreme Court, certainly. California waiver, another big issue. Another issue, but really about undoing. Because all you have to, all this administration really needs to do is undo the Trump decision to withdraw the waiver. And this is an interesting one teed up for judicial review because there are significant federalism issues here. And I can imagine at least Gorsuch and maybe one or two of the other conservative members saying, this statute grants significant partnership rights essentially to the states. And the Trump administration did not have a basis for withdrawing the waiver here. I don't know quite where this goes, but I certainly assume that the Biden administration will reverse the Trump waiver decision. My guess is that decision prevails in the courts, but time will tell. Like many of the rules that where Trump withdrew Obama things, even if the Biden administration doesn't defend the Trump rule, you would expect some automakers, not necessarily all, but some automakers, a variety of interested parties to intervene on the side of the Trump rule. And then you get into, well, should any litigation be stayed pending Biden doing a new rule that would reverse what Trump did? Finally, John mentioned the Energy Department. There are a whole bunch of energy efficiency rules that Obama got. I like O'Biden. Can we call it the O'Biden administration? That the Obama administration got out the door shortly before it ended, that Trump has withdrawn. Certainly, I expect Biden to go back to those rules. Let me talk very quickly. I suspect I've now taken as much time as Dan and Scott, just potential areas of legislation, and I'll hold the discussion, but just flag them. One is, John kind of alluded to, renewable fuel standards might be an area of compromise that would avoid some of the arguments over Clean Power Plan and might be a way to get some of the greenhouse gas reductions in place. Second, emerging contaminants, we haven't talked at all, but Superfund tends to be a very local issue. Fair number of Republicans want legislation on PFAS because they have problems in their districts. So I think that's a possibility. And infrastructure is one. Some elements of a Green New Deal where parties can agree on infrastructure spending is one piece of that. And the other is a version of NEPA reform that progressives can live with that will facilitate getting all the infrastructure we need in place to build out a clean grid. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Seth. And now we're going to start our just conversation about different things. And Dan, I have a question for you, so you have to unmute yourself. But you talked about the transition. We've learned now, I don't think we even knew what a key role that the head of GSA can play in this whole transition process. Can you bring us up to date as what is that role and what is she doing?
Well, as of the moment that we're recording today, the head of the GSA has not signed off on there being a presidential election winner, which is the trigger for the funding to flow and the permissions to enter agencies to go forward. So there is, at the current moment, a kind of a holding pattern in terms of moving the transition forward. I expect that will be resolved in the next few days as these elections become more definitively decided. But there is a possibility that this could become a whole separate legal battle if it were to go on for some long period of time without a resolution. My expectation is that there will be a transition process moving forward. And I think in any case, the Biden team is now raising funds and getting organized. And because we're operating in a virtual world anyway, I suspect they're going to announce the transition team very shortly and have those teams begin to meet as we are discussing over Zoom and to have the conversations begin. But it will be more complicated if they don't have authorization to go and debrief the officials in all of the agencies and departments across the government.
I mean, the only history I can draw from in that is the Florida issue that went to the Supreme Court in the Bush versus Gore decision. And in those circumstances, I don't actually think they certified it until mid-December. So there was a big break between the November election. And I assume that really hurt the transition process.
You know, I actually think the transition teams began to get going even while the election was still pending, because the transition is now quite short. You know, in prior eras, the new president took over in March. So there was a long period of time, I guess, for them to get on their train and make their way to Washington. But we now have a fairly fast turnaround. And it's a lot of stuff that people have to get their arms around in terms of leadership of the new government. And so I'm confident that the Biden team is going forward full bore, that they're thinking about the critical issues. They're assembling their day one agenda, what they plan to do with executive orders. They have a 100-day action plan with a whole number of other things that are being set up for processing and being pushed ahead. And I think you're going to see the president hit the ground running on January 20th, the new president, regardless of whether the transition has been somehow foreshortened.
Scott, when you were general counsel, you had to go through a confirmation. I certainly had to do it as assistant attorney general there. How? Let's assume for a second that the Democrats do not take control of the Senate, so Mitch McConnell remains majority leader. How does that Senate process work? You have Republicans viewing a Democratic nominees. How do they even get the vote under those circumstances?
It's an interesting process to pass through. I wouldn't be eager to pass through it again. But I think some of this turns on the setup between the administration and Senate leaders before names begin to be surfaced. I think that there are some important early conversations between Mitch McConnell and some of the key committee leaders and the president-elect's team that will be very influential in what the composition of the president's team looks like. If the takeaway from that is that the deference that is ordinarily accorded a first-term administration is going to be shown here by the confirmation process, then the administration will have much broader latitude in terms of its nominees. If instead it looks like the confirmation process is going to be a bit of a chokehold and that each nomination is going to be a tussle that might ultimately require a floor vote in order to overcome, then you're dealing with sort of a ticking clock. You can only do so many of those and get your team in place. And there are a large number of appointments that need to happen. If that's the dynamic that the administration sees setting up, it will, I think, move towards more centrist nominees. If we look at the playbook from the past for Democratic leadership groups, the head of an agency like the Environmental Protection Agency will probably be someone with former government experience. I think all of the administrators of within the past 20, 25 years at EPA were former state commissioners, the ones appointed by Democratic administrations. So that's telling in terms of the experience base that is seen as important for that post. I'll also mention that I imagine somewhere in the minds of Team Biden is the fact that some of these institutions like the Environmental Protection Agency are beleaguered or are suffering from very low morale at the moment. The period that they've passed through has been unlike anything since the early years of the Reagan administration. And there may be a thought for a solution that looks like the solution to that period, which is a Bill Ruckelshaus type figure who would be immediately seen as not only a champion for external audiences, but also a champion for a beleaguered workforce. I would imagine that's part of the thought too, is there someone in the suite of possible appointees who would have kind of a rallying effect for the civil servants across the government for whom this has been a fairly challenging period.
Can I make one
Sure.
comment, John?
Sure.
I just think, and I don't mean to be too negative to Dan or Scott, I think Biden has to prepare for no cooperation at all. He can go forward. I'm not worried so much about the transition issues, but I could absolutely imagine Mitch McConnell refusing floor votes on anybody. And I think Biden's got to start thinking about what happens if we can't get a floor vote on, then you start working on, if they were to get to a floor vote, they get a number of Republicans who would support it. But it would be like when Scalia died before the 2016 election. Certainly, Garland had enough votes to get confirmed, but he couldn't get a vote. And we remember what McConnell said about, his one goal with the Obama administration was to make sure it failed. Well, now he's got a majority. It's a lot easier to make sure it fails.
So,
Yeah.
so Dan, this is for Dan then. So Dan, what happens in Seth's scenario that you really can't get somebody confirmed, or it takes longer than you want? What happens to that agency if they don't have a confirmed head or a confirmed deputy or something like that? What goes on?
Well, I think you're going to end up with some acting officials stepping in to guide the structure. Although I think one of the traditions is that people that are being nominated tend not to want to step in and play acting roles. So it's a very complicated story because I think you don't want to in any way alienate the Senate that's going to have to eventually vote on your nomination. So there's generally been a rule that those that would otherwise be taking the senior positions lie low until confirmed. It does mean, and this could be another of the strategies, that you'll end up with a lot of things getting done by executive order without the agencies actually driving the agenda. So it's going to be a stronger White House, perhaps. I also think you might end up with the Biden team working to drive some of the agenda out to the states and working with state leadership to get some of the kind of environmental protection agenda going and the clean energy agenda. So I think it's a very interesting phenomenon if we end up with a deep breakdown. And it is possible. I actually am optimistic that is not going to happen. So I'm going to break with Seth on that point. But I think I don't discount the possibility.
So
Hope you're right.
Scott, this is back to you. At the beginning of the Obama administration, I was the acting assistant attorney general, but you were the acting deputy of EPA, and then later you were nominated to be general counsel. What was that like to be? You're right at the beginning of the administration. It was just being put together. None of the political appointees were in place, and you, as a career person, were in a political position.
It was fascinating. I'll say that it was surprising to me in some ways because I had been in acting political positions before and had been a senior career person for quite some time. So I thought I knew what the White House process looked like and discovered that I understood it much less well than I thought I did, and that there really was a sort of flow to the business of the White House through the White House down to the agencies and departments, that some of which is just not altogether visible by the careerists. And even in times when there aren't efforts to conceal that, it's just that it's a very significant kind of channeling of information and activity that the senior political team alone is dealing with. But during that time, I'd say that was one of the most interesting years of my career because I was the number two to the administrator when she wasn't available. I kind of sat in the administrator's chair and spent a lot of time in the White House, in the Situation Room, and visiting with other members of the cabinet and that sort of thing. So it was really a fantastic experience, fascinating to be involved in the setting up of the Obama machinery in that way. And of course, I had the opportunity to play a pretty significant role in the onboarding of all the political appointees at the Environmental Protection Agency. But on Seth's point, I'm going to go with Dan on this as well. I'm much less fatalistic about how this process is going to work. I also would just observe that the executive branch has found ways to get its business done even without the presidentially appointed Senate confirmed personnel in place. It's complicated, it's difficult. Some issues end up getting pushed up. Those are the ones that can't be delegated to other officials, even acting officials. Others will be decided by acting officials. The construction is set up in a way that there is default authority that is available for acting officials. So a fair amount of the work of an agency or department can be done. This, I think, influences to some degree the obstructionist behaviors of the Senate. I mean, they can't really stop the government from doing its work. They can just make it more difficult. So then that just becomes kind of a cost-benefit equation. How much game really is that in there for them to be that difficult and make it that hard for the new administration?
So I want to just add a thought, because I think one of the reasons I believe we're going to see some stuff move and there will be some bipartisanship is that the president-elect is a longtime member of the United States Senate. He has personal relationships. He's built a career by moving things through that body. And frankly, was attacked during the primary process as someone who was always engaged in give and take, even with people who he might deeply disagree with. And he was seen as a guy that understood the value of a compromise. You know, I salute that. I think that is absolutely essential to good functioning of our government. And my guess is that we may have the best president in a very long time in terms of the knowledge of how to get things through the Senate.
Dan, go further on that. You and I have had discussions about common ground issues, and are there things that Republicans and Democrats could get together on? And I think Seth surfaced some of those issues. What do you think? Are there things out there that, whether or not it requires legislation, just would be more bipartisan? Are those kind of issues available?
I think so. I expect, by the way, that the president's going to be the new president in January is going to be very clear on following through on the priorities as identified. So pandemic, number one, economic recovery, number two. I think the first test of this, John, may well be whether there's some green recovery elements into the economic stimulus program that gets put forward. And by the way, there will be a price for that. There's going to be some give and take. I think Republicans will be able to ask for things they care about. And there will be a trimming of some of the things that might have otherwise been there had the Democrats controlled the Senate. But I do think you're going to see that. I think there's also evidence of potential bipartisanship on some of the funding for government lands and management. We've already seen that go through. I expect an extension of the 45Q tax credits for carbon capture and storage, perhaps even an extension of what they can cover. So I do think that there are some important opportunities here for cooperative efforts to move the points of common ground forward, at least.
Seth, I want to turn to you for a second. This is on judicial review. President Trump is now well known for having put great emphasis on federal courts. I think during his 4 years, he probably has the record of the most district court and court of appeal appointments. And we all know the Supreme Court positions that he's been able to do in a relatively short period of time, to have that many Supreme Court appointments. When we're looking out as to what the Biden administration is going to have to face in court, does that make a difference? Does it make a difference that we have that many new judges that are on the district court and court of appeals bench?
No doubt. So you have to think about different categories of things. And that's why, you wanted a Democratic Senate, because if you do things by legislation, the realm of judicial review is much narrower than if you do things by regulation. Whether this Supreme Court gets rid of Chevron deference, I don't know. I almost think it doesn't matter, because they're going to effectively narrow the deference given to agency regulations. regardless of whether Chevron is, formally overruled or not. But I think there are two related concepts. I think of them as separate, but they've started to merge in my head. One is deference, Chevron deference principally, and the other is the non-delegation doctrine. I see this court as really likely to be very skeptical of regulatory programs that are pushing the boundaries of a statute in one way or another, even if it's only that they say that it does, because this seems likely to be an outcome determining kind of court. But I see, so WOTUS is one, we talked about that already, where you're not the water and you're not the tributary and you're not the wetland, but you're 4 times removed. So again, I don't mean to downplay the environmental significance. The science is clearly there that 4 times removed is still important. But, okay, is it a navigable water? I kind of do get the just skepticism. Like, it's hard to wrap your head around at some point the idea that navigable water doesn't mean navigable water. So that's one where the conservative turn of the courts is going to make a big difference. And again, it's this notion of, Scalia and, we're going to be skeptical where an agency asserts an authority that it hasn't asserted in the past, and it seems to push against what Congress said. So I think what I would call, you can call it the Obama approach or the traditional approach to greenhouse gas reduction requirements that are beyond the fence line. I think there's a decent argument that you can't go beyond the fence line under current authority. And if I think it, then, certainly there's a good chance that 5 or 6 members of the Supreme Court think it. And that's then where you get into things like Section 115 of the Clean Air Act. And I don't know how much we want to get in the weeds, but, can the international air pollution provisions of the Clean Air Act be a basis that somehow the court would support? It's one where you really miss Kennedy. He believed in internationalism. I'm not sure these courts do. And again, then there's the federalism aspect to the judicial review, areas where you can position the aggressive moves that the Biden administration is going to want to make as pro-federalism. So this gets to Dan's point, pushing stuff down to the states. If you take more aggressive action, but you allow the states to implement it, presumably it stands at least a better chance of surviving review. And I'm sure they'll have that in mind.
And John, can I just say one other thing where it really builds on a point Scott made? I think the other big opportunity for the new administration is to rebuild both agencies that have been hollowed out and to bring in new talent, new energy, and folks perhaps even with new skill sets as a way to strengthen the environmental and energy efforts. And building on something Seth was just saying, I think not only will there be some push down of the strategy to have the states do the implementation, I expect there to be some lift up to the international domain. And that what you might see is a new president convening some kind of a conversation with allies on how to strengthen the Paris Accord, how to move together to finance clean energy across not only the developed, but in the developing world. So I think there are levers of power that can be exercised and leadership potential that, again, my view is that President-elect Biden has perhaps the strongest foundation to exercise some of these levers of power and influence. Frankly, I think he may occupy the bully pulpit with more vigor than anyone since Teddy Roosevelt.
You raised something that I think is enormously important and oftentimes overlooked, and that is the importance of the career workforce. I mean, I think statistically, EPA has lost 20% of its workforce. So to do the kind of things that we're talking about, you're going to need more resources. And as you well know, the EPA appropriations also fund state level issues. So this comes back to Scott. So right now, if appropriations matter, I think we run out our appropriations fairly soon. Are we going to face another government shutdown, do you think, during this time period we're in right now?
I'm not going to take the invitation to be Dr. Doom.
Leave that to me.
Yeah, leave that to Seth. It's going to be interesting to watch the emerging behaviors. I would be surprised if the appropriations process that has substantially driven up the national deficit now becomes very concerned about deficit management. That's sort of a play from the traditional play from the Republican playbook as a reason for not building out government programs or rebuilding government programs. And the deficit, which has been remarkably under-discussed by the Congress over the past several years, looms large. My guess is it will reemerge as an animating feature of the conversation about the federal budget. I think somehow, some way, there will not be a government shutdown in the near term. That there will be a cobbling together of continuing resolutions or whatever is necessary to allow the government to continue to function. That's an exciting dance, and it's more likely to wait for the second year of an administration, I think. But always a possibility down the way.
Dan, I want to go back to you. This is not a transition issue. This is law. Right now, President Trump is the president of the United States, and he stays president until January the 20th, which means he has every bit of legal authority that he had when he started out. Do you see him doing things during this time period that are going to impact the Biden administration?
I expect to see a flurry of regulatory packages finalized over the next few weeks, maybe even over the next few days, to try to clear any possibility of coming within the Congressional Review Act. So I do think that there's reason to believe that they'll continue to push the agenda right up to the very last moment. And it does mean that the new team coming in January has more undoing to do. And that will keep them busy for an even longer period of time. But that's my guess, that we will continue to see some degree of not only regulation, but as Seth pointed out, it's sometimes even the layer below that. It's guidance, it's interpretation, it's the kind of signals that get sent about what the regulated community, the business world in particular, needs to pay attention to.
I will make one prediction of the first day of the Biden administration, which I think I can make with fair certainty, since every other administration that I was in did this on their first day. The president puts out a proclamation or executive order that withdraws any rule that has not been yet published in the Federal Register, because as most of us know, it's not really final. Even it might have been signed, but it's not really final until it's been published in the Federal Register. And because every administration I was in, there was a push right at the end to get those last bit of rules out. And a new president comes in and stops anyone, because there becomes a long queue in the Federal Register. Sometimes takes a couple of weeks to get things published. And I can absolutely predict that would be one of the things that would occur. But any other thoughts by anybody else, or things that this president might do during his time period yet?
Looks like he's going to be busy meting out punishment. Folks who were insufficiently loyal to him. We saw the defense secretary being taken out of play. And then yesterday, the fellow who runs the U.S. Global Climate Change Research Program that puts out the National Climate Assessment, Michael Cooperberg, was removed from his position. And in his case, I think he was returned to his permanent slot at the Department of Energy. But it looks like there's a review underway to consider who ought to be reminded about where they stood vis-a-vis this president, that will inform judgments over the next month or so.
Well, and you left out, I thought, one of the most significant, which is demoting Neil Chatterjee, who is
Yeah.
a McConnell guy, which clearly Trump doesn't care about, but it's kind of significant. And I think he may look for other, I don't know who else. That's worth mentioning just because we didn't talk about FERC at all. And a lot of the Biden agenda is going to end up playing out at FERC one way or another. So that's an important thing that we didn't talk about.
Well, Seth, you've also highlighted something which, again, for those who are not familiar, this is the chair of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who I think may have undertaken with the recent FERC order, creating an opportunity for renewable power and for storage, batteries and storage to play in capacity markets and to be part of the wholesale market structure of our grid, may have won the prize for the single most positive environment and energy development of the past 4 years. So while Neil Chatterjee has paid a price and has been demoted out of the chairmanship, I think history vindicates him, and we'll see that as an enormously significant step for what, as you pointed out, Seth, is an important role that FERC has to play in advancing any pathway towards a clean energy future, particularly one that's really focused on deep decarbonization with more energy efficiency and the bringing on at scale of wind and solar and other renewable power sources.
Hey, Dan, we've already mentioned, you did, and then I did, that the first day of a Biden administration, he has pledged that we will come back into the Paris Accords. What does that mean? I mean, what will actually happen? I think we're out of them now. I think that now the time has passed. But just because we raise our hand and say we're in, what significance does that have?
Well, John, as you know, the way that the Obama team joined the 2015 Paris Agreement was structured as a presidential sign-on, effectively going further and explaining an already existing treaty. So basically, they rested their legal case on there being a 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change that had been ratified. By the way, just to harken back to a different era, we might offer a quiz question to our audience about what the Senate vote was on that 1992 treaty. As I'm sure all good students of social studies recall, the advice and consent requires 2/3 of the Senate. And so we'll pause for a moment while people think about what the vote at that time would have been. In any case, I think what you're going to see is the president doing what the new president in January, doing what President Obama did, and in signing on. And by the way, this is a pattern of decision making for international agreements that every president going back to George Washington has done. So not everything ends up being officially put through as a treaty and getting that 2/3 vote, or not even put through as a legislative executive agreement, which requires a majority vote of both House and Senate. And that pathway has been used frequently in recent years as well. But this idea of the presidential sign-on is quite common. I expect that does get us back into the Paris Agreement. And by the way, the world is waiting for the US to be back in. So there is not going to be anyone who says, really, are we really, is the United States really with us? They're eager to have us back. So I think what's going to be interesting, frankly, John, in the story beneath this is the president-elect is committed to a very robust ramp up of the U.S. action agenda, committing to a net zero emissions in the United States by 2050. And that requires beginning immediately with deep decarbonization strategies. And so I think the interesting question is, how far can that go? Obviously, planning processes can begin, but this is one of those cases where you really probably need significant legislation in order to put in place the policy levers necessary to change behavior so broadly, really changing behavior in every sector. We're going to need to have the power sector deeply decarbonized quite quickly. Transportation has to move, a broad electrification of buildings. So there's a lot to be done if this agenda is going to move at the speed and scale that I think the science community is telling us we need. And I believe a policy consensus has emerged around, although outside the United States, with the US not in that discussion in recent years.
Scott, my last question, and then I'm going to give everybody a chance to wrap up, is that you were a leader when you were an EPA and now at Environmental Law Institute on environmental justice issues. I already mentioned in my review of the Biden platform that environmental justice was quite important to them. How do you see that rolling out? How do you see the impact of that in the Biden administration?
This falls into the category of issues for which a fair amount can be done through executive action just by returning environmental justice to its place as a key priority in terms of how the executive branch does its work. There seems to be an intention to do that. There are limitations on how far the law can be advanced in this space without legislation. I am somewhat doubtful that meaningful legislation on environmental justice will be possible with the arrangement that we've been discussing here, although I would hope that it would be, because I do think it's needed. It's a place where we're not really where we need to be with available tools to deal with a very real and significant issue. In the absence of legislation that makes environmental justice more actionable through litigation, the administration will be left with the tools available to it to advance change, which are primarily discretionary tools in terms of how it implements its authorities.
So since I spent most of my life in litigation, I'm going to be the closing judge, and you have that moment right at the end of your case where the judge turns over to you, and Dan, you're going to go first and say, "Counsel, you have 30 seconds to summarize your position." So tell me your closing thoughts on a Biden administration, 30 seconds each. Dan?
So I think we are going to see an interesting moment where there's a choice to be made largely by the Republicans in the Senate about whether they want to work together with the new administration and try to achieve some things on a bipartisan basis, or whether we're going to see ongoing breakdown. I don't think the public is in favor of breakdown. I predict we are going to see collaboration. And one whole line of activity that we haven't yet talked about is an agenda around innovation. Particularly around clean energy innovation. I anticipate we will see funding for ARPA-E, perhaps even the creation of a new technology development group called ARPA-C for climate change action. And I see the possibility of getting budgets restored at the DOE, at EPA, again, on a largely bipartisan basis.
Scott, 30 seconds.
I guess I'm going to aim my closing at our constituency or our listenership, who I'm expecting to be environmental practitioners, lawyers, consultants, those who are involved in the environmental cause in various ways. My thought is that this is going to be a period of growth for this body of work. We've just been through a period of deregulation, which has affected the sort of workflow for a lot of folks in this sector. I think this represents a coming out of that and should be a very interesting period of very meaningful work for people who do the kinds of work that we all do.
Seth, close us out.
So I'm going to throw off the Dr. Doom moniker and just say, it's a great day. And I am overall optimistic. I think a lot's going to get done. You know, the challenges are just scary and almost overwhelming, but we have a responsibility to do what we can as we can. And I think that's what the Biden administration is going to do. And I think it's going to get a lot done. So overall, I'm optimistic.
On behalf of everyone, I want to thank our wonderful panelists, but also I want to challenge our listeners. We're on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, now the largest secular holiday in the world. And we have hundreds of countries. We have 100 million people celebrating each year. Get involved. Learn about these issues that we've been talking about. Be part of what's going to occur. No debate. We're not all going to agree, but we have opportunities in the future. And be part of those opportunities by participating, by learning, by going to school, by being environmentally aware. So once again, EarthX and Bruce and Trammell, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you, and we hope to see you again.